$1 million. For most of us, that's an absolutely life-changing amount of money, right? It's a luxury home in a lot of places, or that retirement nest egg you spend literally decades trying to build up. But right now, in the world of global shipping, $1 million has suddenly come to represent something entirely unprecedented. According to recent reports and maritime analysts, $1 million is the exact toll Iran is now charging a single commercial ship just to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. We're not talking about your standard port fees or international tariffs here. No, we are talking about a localized, physical toll booth set up in one of the world's most critical waterways. And analysts are arguing that this single move is fundamentally dismantling global maritime law as we know it.
Welcome to This Explainer. If you're here, it's probably because you love getting straight to the core of complex geopolitical shifts, and wow, do we have a fascinating one for you today. The core premise we're going to explore is how a single, localized toll booth is completely rewriting the rules of the ocean. Think about it. The last time you ordered a package online or filled up your car with gas, the affordability of those everyday actions relies entirely on a post-World War II rules-based order that was specifically designed to keep the seas open for commerce. But what actually happens when the entity with physical control over a global choke point just decides, well, those rules no longer apply? Let's find out.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1. Paper laws versus physical guns.
So, to really understand the sheer magnitude of this shift, we first have to look at what the rules actually say. UNCLOS, that's the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is essentially the absolute bedrock of international maritime law. It was forged over decades of intense diplomacy, specifically to prevent nations from holding global trade hostage. The treaty explicitly dictates that coastal states cannot suspend, they cannot impede, and they absolutely cannot charge for transit passage through international straits. Now, the Strait of Hormuz is a shared waterway bordered by Iran and Oman, and it falls squarely under these UNCLOS provisions. Basically, according to the paper laws that our modern world economy relies on, this waterway absolutely must remain open and free.
And the legal consensus on this is incredibly strict. Ben Emmons, over at FedWatch Advisors, puts it pretty bluntly. He says, under international law, the U.S. has no legal authority to close, suspend, or impede passage through Hormuz. And the absolutely crucial point to take away here is that this limitation applies to every single nation on Earth. The exact same restriction applies to Iran, to Oman, to the US, and to China. Legally speaking, there is no state with the authority to impose these passage fees. The legal consensus is airtight. There's zero room for interpretation.
But here's where we hit a very jarring contrast between legal theory and physical reality. As we just saw, according to UNCLOS law, there's zero authority to charge or impede vessels. But the reality on the water, which is being enforced by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, looks very, very different. Reports are indicating that there are mines in the water, there are armed vessels actively patrolling the transit lanes, and we're seeing a sudden withdrawal of coverage by major insurance companies. This is prompting commercial captains to literally turn their massive cargo ships completely around. The hard truth that geopolitical analysts are observing right now is that international law really only functions when it's actively enforced. Right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, that legal framework is basically taking a backseat, simply because the entity with the physical presence and the naval guns is effectively dictating the terms.
Which brings us to Section 2, the hidden cost to China.
Now, you might be wondering, how does a $1 million toll actually impact a massive global economy? Well, the answer lies in a seemingly tiny number, 50 cents. It's a fascinating mathematical paradox, really. When a very large crude carrier hauling 2 million barrels of crude oil gets hit with a $1 million toll, the math breaks down to roughly 50 cents per barrel. Now, 50 cents, that sounds like couch change, right? It's something you wouldn't even bend over to pick up off the sidewalk. But in the world of global shipping, couch change breaks economies. When you apply that 50-cent surcharge across the millions and millions of barrels that a nation like China imports every single day, it translates to billions of dollars a year quietly draining out of their economy. And ultimately, that 50 cents trickles down. It weaves its way entirely through the global supply chain, eventually showing up as inflation and making the goods on your local store shelves just a little bit more expensive.
And keep in mind, that $1 million toll doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every single cargo ship traversing Hormuz right now carries heavily compounding costs. Take war risk insurance, for example. That naturally spikes the moment a region is deemed a conflict zone. Then you add bunker surge charges for the extra fuel they need if a ship has to alter its speed or take an evasive path. And we definitely can't forget congestion premiums. This isn't just about localized traffic jams. When these massive vessels are forced to idle, burn fuel, and waste critical days waiting for safe passage, the financial bleed is just enormous. So that 50 cents per barrel, it's really just the newest, most visible layer resting on top of an already towering stack of logistical costs burdening importing nations.
Moving on to Section 3, the nightmare contagion scenario. This whole situation forces us to step back and ask a pretty terrifying question. If Iran can successfully monetize Hormuz, what is stopping other actors from monetizing other choke points? The precedent travels. This is no longer just some localized issue affecting one strait. It exposes a fundamental structural vulnerability in our entire global maritime supply chain.
Think about the potential next dominoes here. We're talking about heavily trafficked corridors like the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Malacca Strait, and the Turkish Straits. Now, you might be thinking, wait, doesn't the Suez Canal already charge transit fees? It does. But those are internationally accepted, legally frameworked transit charges managed by a recognized state authority. What analysts are warning about here is the spread of what they describe as outright wartime extortion. I mean, we've already watched the Houthis heavily disrupt Red Sea shipping, and a senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader has explicitly stated that their regional allies could potentially move to close Bab el-Mandeb as well.
The immense gravity of all this is captured perfectly by analysts over at Cambridge University. They actually describe the simultaneous closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as a literal nightmare scenario. Why? Because that would effectively block a quarter of the world's entire energy supply. Stop and think about what that actually looks like on the ground. A sudden 25% drop in global energy doesn't just mean higher prices at the pump. We're talking about factories shutting down, rolling blackouts in developing nations, severe disruptions to global food production, and massive rapid spikes in inflation. It's a quarter of the globe's economic lifeblood, potentially held hostage by regional actors operating entirely outside of international law.
And the vulnerability is incredibly concentrated. This is crazy. 80% of China's oil imports rely on a single route, the Malacca Strait. For an economic superpower that is almost completely dependent on seaborne imports to keep its factories humming and its cities powered, this new precedent is an existential threat. If the toll booth model established in Hormuz successfully spreads over to the Malacca Strait, China's main economic lifeline is suddenly choked by a massive, inescapable, and completely arbitrary price tag.
Let's wrap things up with Section 4, the ultimate power shift. So what does this all mean? Basically, we are watching a real-time historical shift. The core realization emerging from this crisis is that physical control trumps international law. Iran is currently demonstrating to the global community that holding a geographic choke point overrides every naval convention, every treaty, and every freedom of navigation principle that the post-war order was painstakingly built upon. We're essentially transitioning from a world ruled by diplomatic paper to a world ruled by physical geography. If you hold the water, you hold the power.
Which leads us to this incredibly stark new reality observed by maritime strategists. The country that controls the most choke points wins. In this new paradigm, the global supply chain is no longer viewed simply as just a logistical network of trade. Instead, security analysts are warning that it's becoming a series of potential extortion opportunities. This fundamentally alters global power dynamics. It shifts leverage completely away from international courts and UN resolutions, the institutions that have guided global trade for decades, and it hands that leverage directly to whoever has the physical military presence parked at the narrowest straits.
Because you better believe China is watching this happen, and more importantly, they are learning. If choke points can be seamlessly monetized and controlled by whoever physically occupies them, how will this new rule of power reshape the calculus for the South China Sea? How does this alter the strategic math for the Taiwan Strait? As we watch the rules of the ocean being rewritten in real time, it's a question that will undoubtedly define global security for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explanation. I'll see you next time.